So, Helen, we are very, very honored to have you. Thank you so much for sparing your time during weekend to be here with us on Saturday. And I pass on to you, Helen, please. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah, so thanks again for having me. I'm going to go through some of the background information on why we're even looking at reforesting some agricultural land and how this ties into the wider kind of climate picture and climate goals. And then I will move on to present some of the research that we've done in this area. So I mean, I'm sure you all, this won't be news to anyone, the stuff I'm going to present about climate change, but I just wanted to say before we get into it, it is pretty depressing. So just be aware of that as we go through, that the situation is quite depressing, but hopefully after we've gone through the reforestation results, you will be left with a hopeful impression. So of course, climate change is one of the most severe issues that we're facing. The World Health Organization importantly point out that this is also a major threat to global health. We have the Paris Agreement, which does require us to stay well below 2 degrees, ideally to no more than 1.5 degrees, which was actually, that 1.5 degrees piece was only in there because mainly small island states really fought for that. Otherwise, it would have been well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So the context for that is that we have the G20, which account for really the absolute bulk of current global greenhouse gas emissions. We already have temperature rise above 1 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and this is already having negative impacts. We know from the IPCC's 2018 report that the impacts at 1.5 degrees will be worse than they currently are at current temperatures, but not as bad as if we go to 2 degrees or somewhere around 2 degrees. Also, really important, I think, in this is that the impacts would be greater if temperature goes above 1.5 degrees, but is then lowered down to 1.5 degrees at some point this century. And that's because a whole range of what are called, or what have been termed, tipping points could actually be set off above 1.5 degrees or close to 2 degrees. And just to give you an example of that, so this was published in 2018 by a group of leading environmental scientists, and this is basically an example of some of those tipping points that I just talked about. So if we look at the yellow ones, so this is in the current temperature range going up to about 3 degrees, and that includes some of the major ice sheets and also the coral reefs. And if we go up to 3 degrees, which is sort of where we're heading on the current trajectory, then when we're bringing in major forest systems such as the boreal and the Amazon rainforest. So really, we absolutely don't want any temperature overshoot. So the best option within the context of the Paris Agreement, not the best option for the planet, is to actually adhere to the precautionary principle and the equity component of the Paris Agreement and go with 1.5 degrees with no overshoot. So to do this would require around a 45% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030, reaching net zero by 2050. So that doesn't necessarily mean we won't have any emissions in 2050. It just means that whatever emissions we do have need to be removed somehow elsewhere. So the progress report, this is where it gets pretty depressing as well. So greenhouse gas emissions have actually risen by around 1.5 degrees per year over the last decade. And CO2 from energy use in industry actually hit record high greenhouse gas emissions in 2018. The current pledges to the Paris Agreement would actually take us above 3 degrees warming, above pre-industrial levels, and the chances of meeting the Paris goals on the current trajectory could be depleted by as soon as 2030. So the revision of the nationally determined contribution, so this is what every country is actually committing to do to meet the Paris Agreement in the next year or so, is really the final opportunity to bring those emissions in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So the coming decade is really crucial for climate action. So what we actually need is for countries to increase their ambitions fivefold for the 1.5 degree limit or threefold for 2 degrees. Global emissions need to peak as soon as possible, so that would be 2020 for the 1.5 degrees, so not long left on that. Strong and rapid reductions before 2030, in addition to enhanced longer term commitments. So essentially, if we delay action now, then we are relying on future, currently unproven technologies to actually reduce those emissions later on. So the only way to really avoid this strong reliance on technology is to reduce emissions steeply to 2030 and stick to the greenhouse gas budgets that have been calculated to align with these key temperature goals. So just to cover that in a little, quite briefly, so we have in 2018, the IPCC calculated that we have around 12 years, so this number here, 420 gigatons of CO2, around 12 years of CO2 budget remaining to give us a 66% chance of sticking to 1.5 degrees of warming. So if we actually take off what we've used since 2018, we currently have this figure, which is equal to less than 10 years of current CO2 emissions. So one of the really key things that isn't really discussed that much in climate discourse in general is that in addition to sticking to this carbon budget, we also have to remove massive amounts of emissions from the atmosphere. So somewhere up to 1,000 gigatons of CO2, depending on what happens here with this budget. So if that is, if this budget isn't adhered to, then we actually need to remove even more greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. So just to go through some of the main options being explored for removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So as I said, this is essential for the 1.5 degrees goal no matter what, and more than likely needed for the 2 degrees goal as well. All of the options currently require large areas of land, and there are numerous challenges with the high-tech options, which I will go into in a little bit more detail. So here we have the options along the bottom. So we have restoring vegetation, such as reforestation. We have biochar added to soils to absorb CO2. We have microbes added to soils to do the same thing. And we have basically biofuels and bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So essentially we grow fuels or crops such as miscanthus. We transport those crops to power stations, burn those crops, and scrub the CO2 out of the flue before it actually goes to the atmosphere. So this is where most climate policies are really sort of putting all of their hopes for the future. Right now, this technology doesn't exist at the scale that would be needed, nowhere near, and it would actually, if it did exist, there would be many, many issues with it in terms of how much land it would need, and also the amount of time that it would even take for it to become a net negative technology, given the cycles, the energy required to actually remove the CO2 from the emissions before they're released to the atmosphere. The other component of this is that it requires the CO2 that's removed to be buried somewhere in sort of empty geological formations such as old gas fields. So again, you can imagine this is far from being a done deal, very problematic. And like I said, it is where governments are looking. But actually, if we look at this end, this is really the only option that we have on the table right now at scale needed. Reforestation or restoring native habitats, not necessarily going to be forests. So again, that would also require land. So we need to look at where would we actually restore these forests. If we look at land use globally, agriculture is the biggest user currently. Animal agriculture uses most of that land, 83%, and in return gives us 18% of our global calories and 37% of protein. And conversely, crops use around 17% of agricultural land and really provide the bulk of calories and protein for global consumption. Food production is also really important to consider in this picture, so it's a major contributor to deforestation. It's a direct driver for around 80% of deforestation worldwide. Animal agriculture specifically is responsible for 65% of land use change since the 1960s, and is currently linked to around 80% of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. Forests are, of course, a natural carbon sink. So basically we have this impact that the food system has of actually removing natural carbon sinks and currently occupying that land, preventing those carbon sinks from regenerating. And of course, forests are very important areas for biodiversity, which is a really important linkage and interconnector in the climate space. So one of the reasons animal source foods are so kind of land intensive or land hungry is that they're very inefficient to produce generally. So for example, to produce 1 calorie of beef requires 37 calories of plants to be grown and actually fed to that animal in order to get 1 calorie of beef. Pork requires 12 calories of plants, chicken 9, and eggs and dairy each require 6 calories. Globally, we have a third of all crop calories that are grown are fed to farmed animals, and only 12% of those calories actually come back as human food. So we're already losing more than 30% of calories grown before that food gets to anybody's table. It's actually much more efficient for us to eat plants rather than cycling those nutrients to animals and then eating the animal product. So one example of the US land would, which currently 67% of all calories grown in the US are fed to livestock. But actually, if we reconfigured that land use and produce foods that optimize for human health and least resources, we could actually feed twice that amount. And we could also look at it from the perspective of what if we don't do anything about agricultural emissions and just leave them to sort of business as usual. Well, actually, livestock alone could use half of that budget that I showed, the CO2 or the greenhouse gas budget. By 2030, it could use half of the budget for the 1.5 degrees goal and 37% for the 2 degrees goal. So that is a really kind of near time frame, and a really significant amount of that budget would go just to livestock if we don't do anything about that sector. The greenhouse gas reductions from technology to actually reduce the emissions from the food sector are not enough basically to offset those emissions, and basically changing our consumption of food is absolutely essential. And again, if we don't do anything, this requires other sectors such as the energy sector to kind of pick that up and basically do way more than is planned or realistic for that sector. So we need radical action far beyond that currently planned across all sectors of the economy, and that includes agriculture. So we can't just focus on energy in the climate discourse or climate change plans. So we took this on and focused our analysis on this. So we looked at the carbon dioxide removal potential of returning some land currently used for animal agriculture back to native vegetation cover. Again, we've mentioned that animal agriculture has a large land occupation. It contributes to a large loss of natural carbon sinks historically, and it has a relatively low food output compared to the amount of land that it uses. So it's really a kind of obvious place to start looking for this land that we need to reforest. So a few weeks ago, we published our global analysis of this scenario in Nature Sustainability. So this was a team of us here: Matt Hayak at New York University, William Ripple, and Nathan Mueller. And basically, these were the main research questions that we put forward in that analysis. So we wanted to find out how much agricultural land could actually be restored to native vegetation cover, or looking at another way, how much land that animal agriculture occupies could actually instead be forest or native grassland ecosystems. If we actually did this restoration process, how much carbon could actually be removed from the atmosphere in this process, and what impact might this have on food production? So I just wanted to point out here that it's probably already very obvious, but we model deep transformations to agriculture, and we'd have no consideration for maintaining any sort of business as usual, because that's really very unrealistic for any sector going forward. So our scenarios, the first one, we looked at returning permanent pasture land and animal feed cropland back to its native vegetation cover, which was either forest or grassland. So this gives us the current carbon opportunity cost of animal agriculture. So basically, what is that land in its current form suppressing in terms of the carbon that it could be sequestering instead? We also looked at the carbon dioxide removal potential of 3 dietary scenarios, business as usual, so that's basically ploughing on ahead as normal up to 2050, feeding around 10 billion people by 2050, or taking an Eat Lancet dietary profile, which is around 70% less meat than current, or adopting a fully plant-based vegan diet up to 2050, which has no animal products. So the methodology, we essentially used existing data from the literature and data sets. We combined yields for 175 crops. We basically mapped where those crops are, where permanent pasture land is globally in terms of spatial, and how much of that land is occupied. And we took the FAO's definition of pasture, which is any land used mostly for grazing for 5 years or more for more than 100 days per year. So there is quite a good amount of land there that we haven't included that would be under a kind of temporary grazing scenario. So we have crop allocation for food and feed, which again we used for current existing data sets for human edible crops and those crops that were exclusively for animal feed. So we have that proportion. And then to actually map the carbon content of vegetation, we took an average from 6 global data sets. So this is basically the carbon that would naturally occur if we basically just abandoned that land and allowed it to restore to its native vegetation cover. So this isn't actually a tree planting scenario as such. The average time frame that we assume was around 30 years for that carbon sequestration to actually be delivered in full. And the carbon sequestration that we have actually takes into account the carbon that's already in the pasture or the cropland. So anything we present is additional to what that land is currently sequestering. So if we look at the carbon opportunity costs, we can see here that it's these green areas represent vegetation that would actually restore if that land currently used for permanent pasture and animal feed crops was restored to its natural vegetation cover. So the darkest green here basically represents the densest carbon sequestration or the densest vegetation cover. So you can see even areas such as Ireland, which we think of as already being very green, could actually get a whole lot greener under this scenario. So again, this is the carbon opportunity cost. So this is essentially the carbon that current animal agriculture is sort of displaced by occupying that land instead of its native vegetation cover. So if we look at this opportunity cost by income tier, I think this is where things get really interesting. So we can see here that we have high income countries, and this is their past 10 years of fossil fuel emissions. This is the carbon opportunity cost, and this is split by pastures converted back to forest here. This is pastures converted back to grasslands. This is cropland to forest, and this is cropland to grassland at the top. And you can see here for high income countries, that is almost equivalent to the past 10 years of fossil fuel emissions. And for upper middle income countries, it's almost double the past 10 years of fossil fuel emissions. So I think this is really the most interesting outcome from the whole analysis, really, in my perspective. What we found is that 70% of the sequestration potential or the opportunity cost actually occurs in high and upper middle income countries. And this is roughly split between cropland and pasture in high-income countries, and around 70% from rewilding pasture in upper middle-income countries. So the final slide on the global analysis, so the 3 dietary scenarios that we looked at, separated by land use type. So this again is pastures, and this is cropland. So what this is showing is the amount of carbon dioxide removal by restoring pastures under the vegan scenario, for example, back to its native vegetation cover. And this is the removal we would get from restoring croplands back to their native vegetation cover. So we can see here under a business as usual dietary scenario up to 2050 to feed 10 million people, 10 billion, sorry, we would actually be increasing that carbon opportunity cost or increasing the CO2 emissions from the food sector through deforestation and further land clearing to accommodate food provisions for additional population going forward. And this is basically using optimistic yield assumptions. So even under optimistic yield assumptions, we still require further land to be cleared and a net positive emissions result. So the Eat Lancet diet, which I said is around 70% less meat than current, would result in around 330 gigatons of CO2 removal by 2030. And the vegan diet gives us the biggest CO2 removal because we don't have any animals, which are, like I said, the biggest land users. And that gives us around 550 gigatons of CO2 removed by 2050. Yeah, I just wanted to say as well, those dietary scenarios take into account sort of cultural preferences and are nutritionally adequate as well. So we're not just basically feeding feed crops to people, where this is actually a reconfigured food system to deliver healthy and sustainable food to everybody. So how these go, how these findings relate to emissions and climate goals. So the Eat Lancet diet would actually remove the equivalent of 9 years of past fossil fuel emissions globally, and it would actually roughly equal the amount of CO2 budget that we have remaining. So if we think back to that circle that I showed earlier on, the vegan diet, so you could think of that as doubling the CO2, but I don't think we should think of it as doubling. I think we need to be removing rather than saying that we have more time if we do this. So the vegan diet would remove around 16 years worth of fossil fuel emissions globally, and it's equal to around 163% of the remaining CO2 budget. So under these scenarios, agriculture would actually be a net negative emitter, so it would go from its current being a net positive emitter and contributing to annual or global emissions to a net negative source of emissions. From this global analysis, we disaggregated this down to the UK. So I'll just briefly run through what we did for the UK analysis because it's slightly different, but it uses the exact same methodology, so I won't run through that again. So we actually published this ahead of the global analysis because we wanted to just get that out there a bit quicker. And we looked at 2 main scenarios, so returning permanent pasture and animal feed cropland to forest, because the UK is predominantly in a temperate forest zone. So we made the assumption that it would that land would go back to native forest cover. So this scenario maximizes the carbon dioxide removal, but might not meet micronutrient needs of the UK population if we're to think of it in that kind of isolated way, which isn't really realistic given global trade and the way that different crops grow across the world. So the second scenario, we looked at returning permanent pasture to forests and keeping all cropland in production. So this reduces the amount of CO2 that we could remove compared to scenario 1, but it increases the potential to switch some of that cropland to meet human nutritional needs. So we found that land use, around half of all land in the UK is currently used for animal agriculture, and around 55% of cropland in the UK is used exclusively to produce animal feed. So this is what that looks like spatially. So we can see here is land under pasture, and again the darkest colour represents the highest density, or the kind of most concentrated areas of pasture. We can see the pasture land is mainly spread along the west, and we have cropland here in the bottom circle, which is mainly along the east coast, and again the same colour variation applies there. So again, around half of this is going to animal agriculture feed crops. In England, it's actually 56%. In Scotland, 49% of their cropland is producing animal feed crops, and in Wales, it's around 50%, and Northern Ireland, 58%. So figure 2, this is the cropland area that would actually be restored to forest in our scenario 1. And this is the cropland area that we would have remaining in scenario 1 for human edible foods. And that on its own would actually produce enough calories and protein for the entire UK population. So in this scenario, we'd remove around 4.5 billion tonnes of CO2 over that 30-year period again. And most of that would actually occur from restoring pasture land back to forest cover. So in scenario 2, we just looked at the impacts of restoring reforesting pasture land. So again, all of this cropland would remain under crop production. And it looks a little bit anemic on the map, but there is hundreds of kilometres of cropland in these other countries. So I've just put that on there so that it's very obvious. And this scenario, so this is essentially all of the vegetation that we would have additional to what we currently have. So this would essentially be forest cover, restoring on pasture land, and that would deliver around 3.2 billion tonnes of CO2 removal from the atmosphere. And around 43% of that would occur in England, that's 2% in Scotland, 15% in Wales, and around 10% of that would occur in Northern Ireland. So how does this relate to UK climate goals? So the first scenario is equivalent to around 12 years of UK CO2 emissions, so that is the equivalent amount that it would remove from the atmosphere. It essentially doubles the 1.5 degree budget up to 2050. And it meets 113% of the shortfall between what is currently planned for getting us to net zero and what the actual shortfall is, or what would be needed, sorry, not what is planned. In scenario 2, where we convert pasture to forest, this would remove the equivalent of around 9 years of current UK CO2 emissions, increase the 1.5 degrees budget by up to 75%, and would meet 83% of the shortfall for net zero. And again, in this scenario, both of those scenarios 1 and 2 would actually make UK agriculture going from a net positive emitter to a net negative emitter. There are a ton of potential co-benefits from these scenarios, so I just want to really quickly run through some of those. So basically, if we actually shift some feed crop land to actually grow human edible food, we could address the low consumption of fruits and vegetables in the UK as an example here. We could also help to meet the increase in demand for plant-based foods and provide new opportunities for farmers. We could also massively reduce non-CO2 emissions, so we didn't actually calculate this in our scenarios, but we know that in the UK, for example, this is around 10%, and globally somewhere between 14 and 18%. It would also reduce nutrient pollution in the UK. Pastures are the biggest user of nitrogen. It would also really help with flood defence and water filtration to actually restore the vegetation in those key water catchment areas. And it would also provide habitat for wildlife, which is massively important globally. But just to give you an example, in the UK, the picture there is also very depressing. So we have 15% of species currently threatened. We already have lost 133. Agriculture's had the single largest impact on this biodiversity loss. And just to look at the sort of vegetation cover, again, like I said, the UK is in a temperate forest zone, but we currently only have around 13% left of that forest remaining, which is much lower compared to some European countries, for example. It also provides new opportunities for landowners and recreation for the public. And I think this aspect is really important. So if we think about the sort of numbers and what this means for climate change and temperatures, I think this kind of transformative landscape aspect of these shifts that we're talking about is really worth bearing in mind. If we think about, for example, the well-being benefits of having much greater access to nature, essentially. So what would the UK actually look like, or what would things look like globally under the global scenario? So we don't actually have a UK example, but I do have an example. Let's just see if this works. Let's go back.
Are less than 25 years old. And then, in contrast, you have these very large old ones that are just on their way out. This is about a 70 centimeter diameter aspen tree. Originated in the 1800s, before livestock arrived on Hart Mountain. This one here is 2.2 centimeters diameter. This came in about 10 years ago. We've taken some photographs since the cows have come off and compared those to what the willow looked like with the cows on the refuge, and it's just night and day. Just an incredible flush of willow and aspen all through this streamside area. It's quite a spectacle to see how nature can recover if it's just left on its own, how it can restore itself.
I think, are we good again? Yeah, I don't think you could hear that from the beginning. So essentially, that is a case study of Hart Mountain, which is in Oregon State in the US. And what happened there is essentially the government decided to remove livestock and just let that land re-wild. So this is kind of the scenario that we're talking about in our global analysis. And I just wanted to include that to give you a snippet of really the transformation that we might expect to see in these scenarios. I can share the link to that video as well, because I don't think you caught it from the beginning. So if anyone would like, I can put that in the chat.
Yes, I think that would be really great if you could share
so just
Helen in the chat. Yes.
Yeah, great. I'd be happy to. So just to wrap up before we get to the questions and discussion. So we've seen that agriculture is a leading cause of land use change, contributing to deforestation historically, but is still a major land user globally in exchange for relatively little contribution to nutrition. So repurposing animal agriculture land to its native vegetation cover could make a substantial contribution to climate change goals and help to create Paris-compliant food systems. And I just want to stress that what we're showing here with the reforestation scenarios is needed in addition to strong and rapid reductions in emissions in the short term. So this isn't an either-or scenario. We need to do all of those things. So this isn't basically a get-out card for the energy sector to do nothing. We need to do all of that still. Like I pointed out, this shift has multiple co-benefits to climate ecosystems and human health. Repurposing agricultural land for carbon dioxide removal must be undertaken immediately to reduce the risk of reaching those tipping points that we covered earlier on, and also really importantly to reduce the reliance on technologies to remove emissions later on that currently aren't proven at scale and aren't guaranteed to ever be proven at scale. And also given the fact that these scenarios we're talking about take around 30 years to actually deliver the maximum carbon dioxide removal potential, we need to be starting this immediately. And I think what this shows as well is that animal agriculture is an issue in terms of climate change. It's really kind of heavily CO2 removal discourse. So governments should include this shift in their revised commitments to meeting the Paris Agreement, which were due for submission over the next year or so. And this should actually be developed comprehensively so that the policies actually are optimized for climate, ecosystem and human health benefit. And I just want to stress, as we all know, that this is a really urgent issue and we absolutely need immediate action. And I think, as I said, what we did with this analysis is show that agriculture really needs to be in that discussion quite centrally. And if anyone would like the full reports, our UK analysis can be obtained here. These are publicly available and free to download. And the global analysis that we published in Nature Sustainability, this is a read version, so you can basically read the entire article online. So thanks so much, everybody, for being here. I hope that was an optimistic ending, even though it was quite a rough beginning. I'm looking forward to any questions and discussion that we have